Hello and welcome to Chapter 3 in Developmental Psych. So let's just get started here. We'll get into the slideshow. Chapter 3 is Infancy and Toddlerhood, and there is an immense amount of research on this area. It's not surprising. Infants and toddlers are a captive audience, and there's so much change that's going on, so many models that we have about the behavior that's happening and the changes in development that are happening, that it occupies a significant amount of your book just going over all of these different areas. So I've sort of, cherry-picked some areas that I want you to kind of focus on that I found both interesting but also important in terms of understanding working with clients, working with patients, working with your own kids, and understanding this incredibly vital time of life. So we're going to go through a whole bunch of different models, and then, of course, at the end, talking about the assessments I would like you to do to demonstrate your learning. So here we are, infancy and toddlerhood. Look first at the developing nervous system, and we have a number of processes that are happening during this time. The first is dendrification. Second is synaptic pruning, synaptogenesis, and myelination. Four processes that are happening in the central and peripheral nervous system. Let's take a look at each one of these rather quickly to see how they actually manifest. First, let's look at dendrification. We see as the nervous system is developing, the branches that extend out of neurons. Dendrification means that those branches, the pure number of those branches, the more interconnections between other neurons is increasing during this time. So we can see here in this somewhat more immature neuron, we see there's just a few areas, just a few dendrites, but you look in this much more adult one and you have lots more dendrites. So one of the processes that we recognize in this period of time is an increase in the number of dendrites. Now we can see how this correlates with increasingly complex behavior, which we're going to look at when we look at motor development and cognitive development. This is all happening at the same time, and these dendrites and the dendrification, of course, is really playing a large role in this. Now, the next one is synaptic pruning, and probably, to tell you the truth, I probably should talk about synaptogenesis first, and then synaptic pruning. But nonetheless, here we have a purely graphic representation of as synapses and dendrites are connecting neurons all over the place. You'll see before the pruning lots of branches, but then as we experience things and as we learn them and as we find routine and understanding, and essentially the pathways through the woods become more and more worn, the other pathways that we might have started at the beginning begin to fade away. And those dendrites and those synapses simply disappear. So you look at this model of the nervous system on the left-hand side before pruning, and then you look at this one on the right-hand side. These are the after pruning, and you can see only the very vital connections are the ones that remain. Now, synaptogenesis, of course, is the process of increasing the number of neuron connections, not just the dendrites, but the actual synapses where the chemistry happens in terms of the neuron firing. So the neurotransmitters transmitting from one neuron to the other happen at the synapse. And here's an interesting chart that sort of shows the increase and then gradual decrease of synapses. This sort of captures both synaptogenesis and synaptic pruning. So for example, we're going to look at the prefrontal cortex, something that will certainly come to play when we start talking about adolescence. We'll be bringing up the prefrontal cortex again. And we'll see that early in life, rapid increase in times of neurons, age 2, peaking at age 4, and then synaptopruning as the brain becomes more and more efficient by the age of 10. So you see this kind of increase and then decrease in the number of synapses. And you look at the chart, this is synapses per 100 nanometers squared, so cubic. I mean cubic. So 100 cubic nanometers. There is, you'll see how many synapses are in that area. And then you see the ages going across. And this chart sort of captures prefrontal cortex, the visual cortex, the primary somatosensory cortex, and then the primary motor cortex. Very, very cool chart that shows similar synaptogenesis and synaptopruning happening during these ages. And finally, we take a look at the process of myelination. And myelination is the buildup of a fatty tissue on the outside of the neuron that increases the efficiency of the neuron transmission. Now, I'm going to show you the little movie in just a moment here. The myelination, the myelin is colored white. So when we think about gray matter and white matter as describers of the nervous system, they really visually look at that way. Myelinated neurons look white because the myelin is colored white. Gray matter is not myelinated. Now, the gray matter is muchly confined to the brain. So the brain is sort of a grayish color. Neurons are really close. So their relative need for speed and efficiency is not as necessary as, let's say, in the peripheral nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, the spinal cord and all the neurons that go to our body, those neurons are highly myelinated, and so those appear to be white. So we're going to take a look now. I'm going to actually embed a movie in a movie. We're going to watch the myelination movie right here and take a break from me speaking, and you can watch this video.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss myelin. Myelin is an insulating layer that surrounds the axons of neurons. Composed primarily of lipids, myelin helps to prevent action potentials, which are the electrical signals that travel along axons, from decaying due to electrical current leaking out through the axonal membrane. Myelinated axons thus conduct action potentials more quickly and efficiently than unmyelinated axons, and because of this, many neurons in the nervous system are myelinated. Myelin does not cover an axon fully. Instead, there are intermittent gaps in the myelin where the axon is exposed to extracellular space. These gaps are called nodes of Ranvier, and the sections of myelin that are adjacent to the nodes of Ranvier are called internodes. The nodes of Ranvier are rich in sodium channels, which open in response to an action potential traveling down an axon, allowing positive sodium ions to rush in. This influx of sodium ions rejuvenates the action potential and helps to prevent it from dying out as it proceeds along the axon. Because the nodes of Ranvier are not myelinated, however, the action potential slows down at each node and speeds up as it travels along the myelinated internodes. This gives the appearance that an action potential is jumping from node to node, which is known as saltatory conduction. Myelin is formed by glial cells, but the particular type of glial cell responsible for myelinating axons is different in the peripheral and central nervous systems. In the peripheral nervous system, glial cells called Schwann cells form myelin. Each Schwann cell wraps around one segment of an axon many times to form one internode. In the central nervous system, oligodendrocytes form myelin. One oligodendrocyte can produce dozens of internodes on multiple axons. Because myelin is white, myelinated axons appear white and make up what is known as the white matter of the brain. We can see the importance of myelin to healthy neural functioning when we look at diseases where myelination is disrupted. In multiple sclerosis, for example, deficiencies in myelin disrupt neuronal communication, resulting in a variety of physical and psychiatric symptoms.
Oh, I've never done that before. There we had a video in a video. I hope that actually worked out pretty well. So we learned a little bit about myelin, where it comes from, how it increases the efficiency and speed of the neurons, the neuron transmission, and that those internodal spaces where essentially the axon is exposed, there are additional sodium channels in order to kind of boost the signal. Very similar to, let's say, a cell tower, right? I get onto my cell phone and it locates the nearest cell tower, and then it sends a signal to the next cell tower, and that has mechanisms to boost the signal and then send it to the next one. And myelin works in much the same way. So now we kind of look, well, what is the overall effect of this? So we went over the kind of like infancy and toddlerhood neurological development, but we see the increases in functional development as a result of this increase in neurological development. And we're going to start, first of all, with motor movement, mostly gross motor movement. And we have a nice little chart here. And here we have at 0 months, the child is laying down, and then you'll see they lift their head, then they're up on their elbows, then they're doing a push-up, and then turning over, and then they're kind of like in a semi-sitting up position, then they sit up, then they're crawling on all fours, they're reaching up, and then they're crawling around, moving, using objects, and then finally, by 12 months, they're walking around, potentially running. And what we see here are some interesting processes that we've already talked about. We see the neurological development allowing this kind of progression of increased complexity of movement. The actual process of synaptogenesis and synaptic pruning, dendrification, and myelination all contribute to this increased complexity and coordination of movement. You also see, if you look carefully at each one of these images that shows this progression, we can revisit the concepts of cephalocaudal and proximo-distal. If you look across the top, you'll see that the head is the first thing that comes up. It's not like they kick their feet up. So you start to see this cephalocaudal development. And you see the ability to use the trunk and move the trunk way before they can use their hands and feet. And so you see cephalocaudal and proximal distal development processes happening in this progression in motor development. Cephalocaudal and proximal distal are the directions in which we see dendrification, synaptogenesis, synaptic pruning, and myelination. Those things happen in an order, and that's why we can see the development of a child's motor movement and say right in line with what we would expect from cephalocaudal and proximal development. Now we switch gears here and we look at another area, cognitive development. Now cognitive development is, there's a number of ways in which psychology has decided to look at cognitive development. Here in early childhood, kind of like the leading two models that are out there are the one I'm going to describe now, Jean Piaget's genetic epistemology, and then there's the information processing model. Now those two models describe changes that occur over time related to the cognitive development of a child. Now, the difference between those two is Piaget's is a qualitative change. The actual nature of the way individuals think. That's where we get that genetic epistemology. It means the genesis, not genetic like genes and in our cells, genetic meaning the genesis of our ways of knowing. It's the way those things change qualitatively over time. The information processing model, on the other hand, simply looks at quantitative changes such as attention span, the ability to remember things, a little bit of what we might say is object permanence, which we are going to put into Piaget's work. But we see these sort of measured ways in which we see changes in the nervous system. Now, the brain is incredibly complex, so we're not really as clear as to, the direct relationship between dendrification, synaptogenesis, and myelination related to these kind of specific areas, but we do see them becoming increasingly complex as we age. Now we're going to be covering right now just the first stage during infancy and toddlerhood, the first of Piaget's stages, but let's give you an introduction to Piaget first here. We're going to look at cognitive development, and one of the leading researchers is, of course, Jean Piaget. Now, Jean Piaget's personal history in this is interesting, and I always like to bring a little bit of history to get context of where Piaget was talking, where he was coming from. Now, Piaget was actually very, very brilliant man, very brilliant young man. He wrote his first professional paper at 11 years old. He was an ichthyologist. He studied mollusks and other valved, bicuppid marine animals. And so he's very into the natural sciences, very influenced, of course, by the work of Charles Darwin and all those things leading into the turn of the century and the kind of thinking that was going on then. And he's Swiss, French-speaking, and at one time, if you take my intro to psych class, we kind of go into the development of the concept of intelligence, and we're introduced to Binet. And Binet was a researcher, psychologist in France who was tasked by the French government to develop a test to determine which children needed special services and which ones did not, entering into the school system. And this was the first kind of, evolution of the written intelligence test, which then later was adopted by Lewis Terman, brought over to the United States, and it's now continues to exist as the Stanford Binet intelligence test. But in the development of Binet's instrument, he hired statisticians to do all of the math. Didn't have computers back then to do all of the generalizations and standardizations of statistics and whatnot. And lo and behold, one of them was Jean Piaget. And one of the things that he noticed while he was running the statistics, and this, of course, is very much gives a nice nod to how bright and observant and intelligent Piaget really is that he noticed that when children got the wrong answer, they often chose the same wrong answer. And he thought that was curious. He thought it was, well, why did so many kids, they all got it wrong, but why did so many of those kids pick B instead of, the right answer? So I thought it was curious that there's maybe ways in which children are processing information that would naturally lead them to making those same kind of mistakes. So not really being a trained psychologist, he went home and he started observing his children, which of course any psychologist would say that that's probably not a really good idea, but his scientific observation skills prevailed, and from his observations of his children developed one of the most beloved and long-lasting theories of understanding the qualitative changes of cognitive development in childhood. So that's a little bit of history of Jean Piaget. His theory is known as genetic epistemology. You won't hear that very often, but I really like this term. We usually list, Piaget stages or something like that. But genetic epistemology, this genesis of the ways in which we know information, is a really neat way of understanding how the stages are qualitative changes in the way that we think. He was a constructivist, or basically invented constructionist, and that was the idea that our brains, our minds, are filled with structures that he called schemas. Now, schemas might be a concept or an idea, like we might have a schema of a cow, and this is the example I use in the course book. we have a rudimentary, very early in life, we have a rudimentary kind of idea of what a cow is. And then through processes that he labeled assimilation and accommodation, we actively construct, we add pieces, take things away, modify them, these schemas, so that they become increasingly complex over the course of our lifespan. So the constructionist idea is not that the environment simply places information into your brain and it just rests there. That is not how it happens according to Piaget. We take information in and we work it in our brains and we create our own personal schemas or ideas of varying complexity depending on what we are specialists at. Over time, we construct those. So the idea of constructing your mental capacities is something that was very much a part of what Piaget introduced. So we have this constructivist idea, we have schemas, we have the processes of assimilation, bringing in new information, and accommodation, changing existing schemas in light of new information that we've just assimilated. These two processes continually happening throughout our lifespan. And he developed a stage theory to describe moving through infancy and toddlerhood right up until adolescence and young adulthood. And we're going to take a look at that model right now. The first stage is a sensory motor stage, essentially the qualitative aspect of an infant's cognitive development is a connection between their sensations and their motor movements. Very rudimentary understandings of the world, and that's the one we're going to focus on today. The next stage, pre-operational. Now this word operational is going to appear in each one of the following stages. Now, this operations are schemas. So this is the stage prior to the internalization of objects from the outside world. So there are yet to be internalizations of the outside world, and they develop during the pre-operational stage. So a child in the pre-operational stage experiences information, but they're in the process of creating this very basic schema. So they might hear, again, I'll use cow. They hear a cow, and they're just beginning to put those together as internal representations as they move away from the sensory motor, just receiving and stimulus response kind of thing, and it starts to become more complex. And their brains start to say, okay, I can remember things, I can store information, so I'm going to start storing these rudimentary schemas that I've been experiencing, and the process of assimilation and accommodation continues to provide that child with the ability to modify those schemas. Hence, why it's so important for children at a young age to have an enriched environment that provides the opportunity to assimilate new information and change existing ideas. And that's almost as important. And if you kind of think of what Piaget was looking at when he first got curious about this, it was the mistakes that really drew his attention to what was going on. And here we have the ability, the capacity that we have to look at the existing structures that we have inside and say, nope, that doesn't work anymore. We've got to throw that one out or throw pieces of it out and replace it with new ideas to accommodate to new information. I mean, there's something very, very important about this, and maybe there's something important about why this is something that we should be able to do for our entire lives. That even though we have deeply embedded schemas that have rung true for us for years, we can still embrace that childhood capacity to still accommodate those ideas to new information. The sociological and political ramifications of what I just said are boundless. It's very, very important that we maintain that ability to continue to accommodate our existing schemas to new information. Pre-operational stage, those are developing at the beginning. They're not there. By the end of this stage, they have a whole collection of internalized schemas, and those schemas represent concrete operational. Those schemas are largely dependent on their experience. Their experience is limited by physics. It's limited by time. It's limited by experience. So their concepts, the schemas, will simply be based on their own personal experiences of diversity, variability, modifying different things, what's possible and what's not possible. And you'll see that it's gonna really relate to when we start talking about adult development, about the capacity for someone to be able to see beyond sort of black and white. Today we encounter people who largely think on concrete operational ways. That's the way I've always experienced it, so that must be the way it is. And that's decidedly concrete operational thinking. The next stage, which we won't get into for quite a while here in the class, is formal operational thinking. Now, formal operational thinking is the ability to take those existing schemas and imagine beyond your personal experience. This is the ability to imagine different schemas beyond your personal experience, maybe even beyond the possibility of physics. I can imagine a house, and now I can imagine a house growing and shrinking, and I can put it in a thimble and put it in my pocket, and that sort of bizarre storytelling sort of way of encountering physical objects necessitates the growth of abstract reasoning, symbolic reasoning, problem solving, perspective taking. All of these start to come from there. You'll see here we can actually even track children's literature that goes from very tactile movement books of, fuzzy letters and the scales on the alligator. You're really looking at kind of basic motor cognitive connections. Then we go into pre-operational, just the picture books about representations of things, very simple pictures. And then we go into books that are stories in that sort of concrete operational. But then toward the end of those children's books, we start getting into fantasy, into impossible situations, at least as we experience them all day, in order to develop the ability for a person to be able to think abstractly. Piaget himself said, we are largely not in need of formal operational thinking. We get along pretty well with almost everything we need to do is in concrete operational thinking. I can balance my checkbook, I can pay my bills, I can drive my car, do many, many things based on concrete operational thinking. There are many other things, however, more complex ideas, politics, voting, higher education, problem solving, perspective taking. These kinds of things they necessitate, in order to fully engage in these things, you have to enact formal or operational thinking. And so we'll get a little bit more into that when we talk about how these stages impact later in development, when we have formal operational thinking, how it kind of throws a whammy in adolescence, and then we sort of reel it in during emerging and young adulthood so that we're ready for its application in middle adulthood. So for now, we're still here with Piaget, and we're going to take a closer look at this sensory motor stage. Now, the sensory motor stage, this is the first stage, and it, just like the name says, it is this experience of the connection between motor movement and sensory experiences. You can imagine there's a child laying in their crib, and they're kind of like just looking around, and they're just soaking up information, but their body's also moving around. They're just random movements. And we'll see in this particular stage, there are some sub-stages, and we'll see how that random movement of an infant in a environment that's going to allow this to happen really triggers that first connection between motor movement and sensory experience. So we see there's sub-stages, and here's a graphic representing all of them, so let me blow it up for you here. And the first one that we see is the top left, primary circular reactions. And of course, we're going to have secondary and tertiary circular reactions. The primary circular reactions happen around 1 to 4 months. And here's what they actually represent. It says they begin to repeat pleasurable actions. So you have the child that's sort of like waving their arms around. They're in their crib, and you're supposed to put it close enough for this to happen. They hit the mobile. And suddenly, those shapes are flying around all over the place. Well, that's cool. So the baby tries to do it again. And it's still, they have, very little control. So they're whacking the bars and they're, doing whatever they're doing. But eventually, they start doing it over and over. And then when you have those crib or playpen or the toys that are, they're mirrors or things that they spin and they make sounds, they press a button and it's a buzzer. All of these things are really to encourage primary circular reactions. So the child begins to say, there's a connection between my movement and something happening. This sort of cause-effect relationship. And that's that first cognitive thing that Piaget observed. Now you got to think about this. When he's looking at his own kids, he saw all this. This is really, really, keep in mind the origins of this and how brilliant Piaget was here. The second one, secondary circular reactions, these occur 4 to 8 months. And what we see in secondary circular reactions is the actual characteristic of the objects become memorized. So the child interested in that particular stimulus will seek out that object. So it's sort of random at the beginning, just repeating things, but then you'll see in this stage, they'll reach for I'll keep this simple, they'll reach for the rattle and shake it, they'll reach for the ball and bounce it because they understand rattles shake and balls bounce. It's like almost this kind of like elementary understanding of physics, that the rattle will rattle. So that we can almost imagine, I want to hear a rattle, and they're not going to go to the ball and shake it because they've already learned that the ball is for bouncing and the rattle's for shaking. And so they'll actually seek it out, and as soon as they pick it up, they'll start shaking because they know what it does. That's that secondary circular reactions. And you folks who have children, you're probably like, yeah, I hope, I remember when that was going on. Now, we're left with this last piece here, this tertiary circular reactions appearing in 8 to 12 months. And this is the really kind of fun, well, it's all fun, but great stories about this. Tertiary circular reactions were, according to Piaget, the realization that children are actually scientists. That the innate capacity that we have to investigate, experiment with, and understand the world mirrors the scientific method. And it appears for the first time in tertiary circular reactions. Now what this is, I've already told you that during secondary circular reactions, we have the child understand the properties of balls and rattles. They understand that balls bounce, and rattles shake and make sounds. During the tertiary, you might start to see them experimenting. They say, okay, I got this. This thing bounces, this thing rattles. I wonder if this will bounce. And they throw it. They throw the rattle. They just bounced the ball. That's cool. Does this bounce too? The cat comes along. Uh-oh. Does this bounce? We see that you put a plate in them. You've just thrown a Frisbee at them. It's your fault. They put a plate in front of them and they're like, well, I wonder what this would look like. We just got done tossing the little frisbee or tossing the ball. I think I'm going to toss this. And what happens, it's cacophony. How cool is that? They throw it, the SpaghettiOs are all over the place. Everybody's running around. Some people are laughing. Some people are screaming. The dog's having a ball, licking all that stuff up. How cool is that? But the child is experimenting, looking for the limits of the physical objects that they have. And you can, in this whole process, I hope you can see the appearance of assimilation and accommodation happening all through this. Primary circular reactions, secondary circular reactions, really building those initial schemas. And now, in tertiary circular reactions, we're moving into the cognitive complexity that allows the child to not only determine what something is, but what something is not. It's this rattle is a rattle, it's round, it has colors, they're learning all of those things, but it also doesn't bounce. Listen, it doesn't bounce in the same way this ball does. And when I threw it, Mom didn't have that same gleeful laugh, that came out. She's like, don't throw the rattle. That's not for throwing. It's the knots that start to come in. And you see how that's refining. It's accommodating those schemas inside. Just very, very exciting time. And all we need to do is provide them with stuff. Not even expensive stuff, just stuff around the house. Well, keep the sharps away and all that stuff. But a paper box, a ball, pots and pans, spoons, wooden spoons and utensils, that is all they need. And they're going to be experimenting with these and creating incredibly complex schemas throughout this process. So really, really very, very interesting time. So we move back into cognitive development and we have the appearance, which is somewhat of a quantitative aspect of cognitive development, but it has qualitative aspects as well, and that is object permanence. Now, I have a video about object permanence that's in the course book, but to explain it pretty succinctly is there is a point at which, just like all other objects in the world, there's an internalization that happens of the schema inside, that as that internal schema becomes strong enough, becomes refined enough to the point that the child will begin to understand that the object continues to exist when it is no longer in their immediate sensory circle. When you take a very young child who's going through those primary and secondary circular reactions, up to a certain point, if you show them like a happy little doll or something, and then you hide it, as soon as you hide it, cognitively speaking, it doesn't exist anymore. The child, it's gone, they start to look for something else. They start to look for something else that would be the next stimulating thing. That's what they're naturally attracted to. Then there's a time at which, when object permanence kicks in, if you hide it, they're going to try and find it. They're going to be looking around. Where did it go? They might not have the logic that all you did was put it underneath, the cloth or something like that. They won't lift up the cloth yet. They don't have that sort of pathway. I saw it go and then it hid. But they know it's still there, so they're going to be looking around for it. And you can almost sense by their behavior, they know it still exists. And that's that sense that we have of object permanence. This is why peekaboo is very funny for a young child. Now, if you think about how we might do that with a baby, okay? If I walk up to a baby and I walk up to my child and they know me and stuff, and yes, there is recognition. This is familiar. This is a safe face. This is a safe place to be. This is a person who's been caretaking with me. But the internal representations are not solid. If I go like this, I don't exist. When I go like this, I magically appear. And the kid's all excited. And I go, peekaboo, and I've come out of nowhere. I've sort of appeared out of space, this familiar face. Now, after a while, that really doesn't work because you're going to go peekaboo, and they're like, well, you didn't really go anywhere. Just put your hands in front of your face, and the kids are advanced. You got to find more clever ways to freak them out. And so object permanence is that thing that develops, the capacity to know that things continue to exist even when they're out of sight. So it's literally out of sight, out of mind. And it's frustrating for some parents. It's a little disconcerting to know that the child that you love and care for doesn't know you exist for a while when you leave the room. They know that when they can scream and yell and that their needs will be met, but they're not saying, hey, Roberta, I know you're out there. I can hear you mucking around in the kitchen. Please come and see me. It's not that complex. It's not that complex. So those individuals, those young children, they're simply sending out the signals. They're doing the motor movements that they know have produced these sensory stimuli. This is very sensory motor, very primary, secondary, whatnot. But then as they get into those tertiary and they start moving, in this case, away from sensory motor and into pre-operational, those internal representations become more and more solid over time. And the first sort of indication of that is object permanence. Okay, so there's our little travel down cognitive development. Let's take just a little bit of a right turn. Very, very important in terms of the cognitive development, and that is the development of language. Now, I was going to show a video again. I was going to show this one. This one is the Crash Course Psychology number 16 on language development. It is awesome. It's one of my favorite videos of all of them. I don't want to show it because I think I might be violating some copyright issues or something, and I certainly don't want to make these people angry. So go ahead and watch this video. It goes into language development. What is language as opposed to just sounds that have meaning and whatnot? Language is a little bit more. How do we get it? The introduction of the language acquisition device by Chomsky. All of these really, really cool things. And language being, this is the deal. Language is an amazing tool for compressing information. Now we think about this in terms of Piaget's schemas. Every word that you know is essentially the written or auditory representation of a schema. And these single words can have immense meaning. So they are very, very compact ways of translating information from generation to generation. They're very full of information. Just single words can contain books and books of information that are associated with that word. So if it's something like screen, I'm looking at a screen right now, and you think about a TV screen or a computer screen, but you can also think about a screen on a window, or a screen as a basketball player moving in the line of sight of somebody, so they're blind for a moment, and someone can hide a play in there. All the different ways, just that word screen, and it goes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Language is truly, truly, as far as we know, that which differentiates us from the animals. The animals communicate. And increasingly, we might be finding that there are some animals, particularly whales, may have language, still kind of working on it. But human being language is immensely complex. All the different languages all over the world, the similarities between those, really, really fascinating research about the similarity between languages, even though those cultures may have never even connected with each other. But great stuff, lots of great stuff in this video. Make sure that you watch that video as we move on to this next aspect of the class, and that is social development. Let's keep in mind too, all along, let's keep in mind that first part of what I've been talking about with that neurological development. We're still talking about dendrification, synaptogenesis, synaptic pruning, and myelination. And the biological, let's say in biopsychology, those are why these things are developing, because we have more connections, we're refining those connections, and our connections are becoming faster and more efficient. So so therefore over time, as these neurological processes start to happen, well, of course, our schema is going to become more complex. Our language is going to become more complex. And as we're about to launch into our social interactions with other people are going to become more complex, all because of this neurological development. So let's take a look at the aspects of social development that I cover in the course book here. We have, of course, the first representation of personality, and so in early childhood we call that temperament. And the prevailing theory of temperament is that is one that was developed that identified kids as quote unquote easy, kind of laid back, difficult, a little fussy, and then slow to warm up. And in fact, there's a whole bunch that, were mixes of these. The problem with this particular theory is that what is easy and what is difficult and what's slow to warm up kind of depends on the recipient, on the adult that's sitting there. Like I know some parents who they could have little hellions going on and they're like, they're just full of joy and happiness as their kids wrecking the house. And they're just like, all kids are easy. And then there's other parents, there's other adults that's like, if this kid drops that popsicle on my couch, I'm going to lose it. And that every kid's difficult. So this is really not as much a description of the child as much as it is a description of the relationship between the child and the adult. Now, there's no doubt, if you have a kid that's running around, crashing into things because they need that stimulus and all that, that can be challenging. And that is an aspect of their personality. It is an aspect of who they are. And we try to understand those things. But this definition of personality, as we see it in early childhood, is not really comparable to when we talk about personality later in life, which we'll bring that up when we start talking about personality theory and how that starts to develop with identity, with social interactions, with the development of a life course and all that stuff that we'll be getting into later in the chapter, later in the course. So there's another aspect here, and that is attachment. This is a very, very important area of development that kind of leads very, very easily into the next area where we're going to be talking about Erikson's psychosocial development theory. Attachment is a really, really key part. Let's look at very, very early in life. The first relationship that a child has is, of course, with their primary caregiver. And the mechanisms by which there's a bond that exists between the caregiver and the child is an important aspect in Erikson's theory, which we'll get into in a little bit, in terms of developing a basic sense of trust in the world. So this first sort of, when they're coming into the world and they're in that primary circular reaction area, they're just a stimulus around. There's a big difference between stimuli from your environment that are caretaking and responsive to your needs and stimuli that are not caretaking to your needs. Now imagine if you're a crying child and the response to that is nothing. You're neglected. Imagine not only the emotional impact of that, of the world is not responding to my needs, but the cognitive impact. I'm doing things and there's no response. I'm screaming my lungs out and nothing's happening. I'm thrashing about, and my actions seem to be independent of when I get fed, or if I get fed or cleaned or whatever. And you can see how profound an impact neglect, let's say, at this early time, which of course is measured by the degree of attachment, can be on that child's emotional and cognitive development. So critical times, attachment is a whole line of research related to attachment, has a lot to do with the goodness of fit between the personality of the caretaker and the person and the child. We have issues like postpartum syndrome that can get in the way of this, with depression and different emotional experiences that parents can have after their child is born that interfere with that very important immediate attachment. Let's face it, you have a child, and people will sometimes say, and this is sort of the shaming that goes along with postpartum, is that people will say, there's a lot of pain in childbirth, and then as soon as they're born, you forget about that pain. Now, I've asked a lot of moms about that, and I'm not sure where people got this idea, but people don't forget the pain. They remember that. Now, nonetheless, I'm a guy speaking, so I don't really know a lot about this, but, I've heard that people continue to feel and remember the pain, but their attachment kicks in, and the emotional connection to the newborn child overrides, any frustration or whatnot can be associated with that pain. Now, imagine, however, that sort of connection to this child doesn't happen right away. And you're stuck with the pain, and then this incredible amount of caretaking that has to go along with this. Babies don't come with instructions. They don't come with all the equipment that you need. They don't come with the tools to fix them. It's all, and for many people, it's an incredible amount of work to just simply keeping that child alive. Without the emotional attachment, that can be an extremely challenging thing for someone to take on. So we see a threat to attachment, trust, emotional and cognitive development when we have an experience of postpartum depression or other emotional reactions. We also see issues coming up when the children who are born, or the adults, I guess I can say, have disabilities or are born with physical abnormalities or something like that. And I'll give you a case study about this. When my oldest daughter was born, Hannah, we were at the hospital, and the hospital had a service where you could buy newborn pictures, and of course that's all the rage. And there was a photographer, specialized, set up. It's a camera that actually looks down, looks like one of those old overhead projectors. The camera looks down, and you lay the baby down on this pink or blue blanket, and they take the picture, and that would be like baby's first picture. And I was talking to this guy when we were getting our pictures done, and it's still in the hospital, and I actually asked about cleft lip. When a child is born with a cleft lip, it means their upper palate has not completely come together. Something happened during that critical period, like we talked about last time. So cleft palate happening, and he said something very sad, but something very real that we need to contend with. Now, this is decades ago, so case study. He said he's never taken a picture of one. Never taken. He's encountered parents. He's gone up to them. You ready for your pictures? And whenever those parents were parents of a child with a cleft lip, they said, not at this time. Something is happening. I'm not going to assume, and we're not saying these are bad parents. We're not saying anything about that. Can't even really say whether, you certainly can't say whether the person's going to be well taken care of or not. But the photographer was saying, this is symbolic of something. Then with that information, I actually went to the social worker and I said, so what's this about kids with cleft lips, with a physical abnormality? It looks kind of gross and, all those kinds of things. Just looking at it objectively. And he said, by policy, every parent family gets a social worker assigned to them if they have a child with cleft lip, because the danger of that particular abnormality affecting attachment and thus emotional and cognitive development is so high that social work comes in right away. even though the child may, I mean, obviously there's other things. The child is not able to nurse sometimes, so there's nutrition issues. There's imagine the mom who's looking forward to the connection of breastfeeding their own child, and the child is born and they can't have that connection. That's disappointing. No matter how you write that out, that's disappointing. And it's that much more important for that family to engage in getting help to make sure that that attachment still happens during those first few days and few weeks with that child, so that that emotional and cognitive development can happen. So we see these things happening very, very rapidly, and that's where why these things are so important. And we've sort of already talked about today how it's important for both cognitive and emotional development. Now, we of course have a theory, attachment theory. We're going to go into some detail about that. And that was developed by a scientist, John Bowlby and Marie Ainsworth. And what they're famous for is placing children in a stranger situation. Now, the stranger situation is this. Picture, this is an experimental situation. You have a child and their mom. And what we're trying to observe is the behavior of the child that indicates their attachment to mom. So the baby is in a room with mom. And here's the pattern of behavior. A stranger walks in and sits down. They observe what happens. Mom gets up and leaves the room and leaves the baby with the stranger. What happens? And based on these repeated observations that Bowlby and Ainsworth did, they recognized 4 different kinds of general patterns of behavior that they call attachment theory. So let's take a look at each one of the patterns of behavior that sort of indicate the kind of attachment that is developed in children, and they saw it in the general 4 categories. So we have this graphic here, and then we're going to go right into close. The first one is secure attachment. Now, secure children, when they were in the presence with their mom, they would go out, they would feel secure, they were exploring, they're happy. Mother's behavior was quick, sensitive, and consistent. The basic attachment is that believes that trust that their needs will be met. These children, when the stranger came in, went to their mom as a secure place to go, and then slowly ventured to be with that stranger, and understandably fretted when mom left. Their secure base, when mom left, the child fretted. So a securely development child should feel fairly uncomfortable when their mom leaves them with a stranger. That's secure attachment, because that's my base, and my base just left, and I don't know you, and this is not right. And they might go to the door and they might start crying. That's considered, and in this model, secure attachment is sort of like the thing that we want. Okay? So let's take a look at the others. We have avoidant attachment. The mother's behavior is distant, disengaged, maybe they're on their phone. The child, not very explorative, emotionally distant. Subconsciously, the child has decided that their needs are probably not going to be met. They don't really use their mom as a base. These kids, interestingly enough, will sit with their parents alone, and the observations are what we're looking. Mom's disconnected, child's disconnected. Stranger comes in, and in some cases, the child will go right up to them. The child would just, and when mom leaves, okay, she wasn't really that dependent anyway. And if this person is going to give me attention, that's fine. And it's interesting because, well, it would be really cool, for example, and we all think about when we drop off our kids at daycare or something like that, and they completely become unglued, and we're like, I wish I could just, leave them there. But yet, those kids becoming unglued is actually an indication of secure attachment, whereas dropping them off, now this is not 100%, please don't go diagnosing your sister, kind of thing. Drop off your kids and they're like, see you, Mom, and they just go. That will happen naturally later, but, for them to just go with strangers, it's sort of like, might not be a problem, but certainly it's something that they identified and they called it avoidant attachment. Now then we have here ambivalent attachment. This is very similar, but mom's behavior, rather than being consistently detached, sometimes they're sensitive, sometimes they're neglectful, sometimes they're wishy-washy. Sometimes they're really, really involved, and then sometimes they're totally detached. This creates actually one of the more disruptive types of attachments, and that's ambivalent. Actually misspelled on this graphic. They cannot rely on their needs being met. They're very anxious, insecure, angry. They'll be anxious, insecure, and angry when they're alone with their parents, and they will be anxious, insecure, and angry when they're left alone with a stranger. The child's behavior remains consistent. And then finally we see disorganized attachment. The mother's behavior is extreme. She's frightened. She's frightening. She's passive. The child is depressed, passive, angry, non-responsive, severely confused, no strategy to meet their needs, kind of more extreme kind of thing. The interesting thing about this level of neglect is that children tend to be resilient. Not all, let me correct that. Some children can become extremely resilient and from very neglectful environments grow up to be very self-reliant and very successful. Possibly and probably some emotional developmental issues, but nonetheless, kind of doing okay. So we see these combinations, and Bowlby and Ainsworth sort of saw these patterns and felt, a combination of the mom's behavior and the child's reaction to them producing these sort of emotional attachments. Now, think about that ambivalence idea. And we saw that in a couple of these where they weren't really sure where things were going to come from. What a weird place for a child to be. I'm not really sure. And I can't reach the food. I can't cook the food. I can't get in the refrigerator. I can't change this diaper myself. My brother did that. He was amazing, but I guess he was able to do that. I was too young. I wasn't even around for a while. But he was able to do that. But most kids can't really do that kind of stuff. They're so dependent. And imagine growing up that your mom or your primary caregiver doesn't have that consistency. I've actually been in the presence of one of these individuals here, where the mom was extreme, frightened. She was frightening, reactive. And it was unpleasant. It was decidedly unpleasant. And to see the child would hit the mom. This is a case study. Don't generalize this. Case study where the child was very abusive to mom. And this was extremely frightening to mom. She thought she was, the devil had not really, but had, that she had the devil child. And that the child was abusive to her. Very young child, like 1.5, and was just wailing on his mom. And showed a lot of anger. And it was very, 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 very weird situation of that mom being in a very, very horrible situation, and then bang, she's like in charge of raising a child. Just very, very challenging situation. Okay, with that cheerful thought, let's take another journey here into another model, and we kind of approach the end of our chapter here and bringing in a theory that's going to be with us for pretty much the endurance of this entire class, and that is Erik Erikson's psychosocial development theory. Erikson himself was a student of Freud, he departed with Freud. Freud considered the quote-unquote father of developmental psych because he was one of the people that came up with the first stage theories describing first, I mean, this is good stuff. Stuff that happens in childhood affects you later on. We got to thank Freud for that. That connection between early childhood and later dysfunction is something that Freud brought to the table. He also talked about stages. Now, his stages often get misinterpreted because they're called psychosexual stages, and he talks about sexual energy, which is driven by an instinct for procreation based on the biological model. But in infancy, it's not sexual, it's sensory, and that the sensations of the human body move across the human body, and Freud identified stages. So you had the oral stage, anal stage. I don't really study them a lot, so I can't remember what they are. But and he called it psychosexual stage theory. Erickson came along and said, I think that the real issue is that there's this evolving psyche, the mind, that is interacting with an equally responsive, not responsive, evolving environment, the social world. Children are raised in a context of a social group, the family, the community. So they're raised in and there's a constant, not really battle, but a figuring out of each other, this reciprocal relationship between an environment that wants to take care of the child and the child that's developing an environment that's trying to figure it out as the child is figuring itself out. So these challenges come along, and so Erickson kind of broke with Freud, renamed the theory psychosocial. He actually coined that term, even though we use it for different aspects now, for different concepts. But that psychosocial is really describing the relationship between the emerging psyche and the social environment in which the child is being raised in. So the graphic representation of this that you will see throughout this class is right here. These stages starts here on the top left hand, or kind of in the middle left hand. Look at infancy, trust versus mistrust. This first one, first stage. And you'll see all of the theories that I've talked about, everything from the biological to the cognitive, into language development, social development, all of these attachment leads to this notion of an internal representation that the world is a good place to be and it wants me here. Basic trust in the world. That's what Erickson called, and we can see that developing as the child's neurological development starts to happen and they start developing schemas about the world. Are they developing a schema about their caregivers in the world, that those caregivers love them, will support them and are responsive to them, or not? Along a continuum, trust, mistrust. It's not one or the other. It's along some sort of continuum. Now, when we have neglectful, fearful, unresponsive parents or environments, you would, of course, assume that the child's going to develop deep, deep mistrust in the world. There's pretty good evidence that it doesn't take a lot for children to go the positive way. That, there's lots of stories of very, very neglected individuals, namely in the book A Child Called It, who was raised in an incredibly abusive and neglectful environment and yet developed great psychosocial trust because of a teacher that they encountered. It didn't, you don't know where that's going to come from, but presumably in that kind of environment, they develop a sense of mistrust. As long as we're doing most things right, not perfect, as long as we're doing most things right, kids will probably end up with a pretty good basic trust in the world. And they're able to navigate that first stage. But you can see how that relates to everything. Everything in that internalization of the world. And once they get that, as the world is a trustful place, it's pretty hard to break out of that unless you have some pretty significant experience to the contrary. So in understanding Erikson's theory, we also understand that once somebody goes on the negative or once somebody goes on the positive, they tend to stay. Not only because particularly for the first 4 stages, they're living in the environment that produced those first feelings and emotions, so those continue to develop in those directions. But when you start with a bad brick on the bottom of the foundation, the roof is almost guaranteed going to fall. You know what I mean? It's like you're building a house on bad bricks. And so you would want to understand that those foundational aspects of a person's sense of self that begin very, very early on are big components, very important components of their development. Now, when we look at Erikson's theory here, and we're looking at infancy and early childhood here, toddlerhood, the next one is autonomy versus shame and doubt. Let's look at the word autonomy. As children are developing, getting increasingly complex nervous systems, they want to do things on their own. They see you tying the shoes. They want to tie their own shoes. They see you stacking the dishes. They want to stack the dishes. They see you using a big cup. They want to use a big cup. And we're like, oh, what are they going to do? Going to give them the glassware and stuff. And all of that is their eagerness to express this newly developing nervous system, and we're going to see this in Piaget's stages, particularly when we look at stage 4. They want to start trying things on their own. So here, if you kind of want to look at it this way, you have trust and mistrust in the first year, and then what's the second year? Call it the terrible twos, right? Now we're going to see the 3s are worse, but the terrible 2s are they start doing things on their own. So I so clearly remember, this is an example, my younger daughter, Mara, was in this stage of life, and we're leaving, and I ran late all the time, so we're running out to go see a movie or something like that, and she has to tie her shoes and won't let me do it. We're in a hurry, and I'm like, Mara, we'll do this another time. We'll just let me tie. No, she has to do them. And part of the terrible 2 syndrome, kind of sit there and like, okay, we're going to be late for the movie. Now, interestingly enough, I remember clearly, so clearly. I don't remember the date, but I remember the day she came down the stairs. She sat down, tied her shoes, and she stood up and said, I tied them all by myself. And she ran outside, and I got choked up. It was not good. I had a dad moment of like, I'll never tie her shoes again. Well, I'm glad I don't have to tie her shoes now, but it was a rough moment. And so that developmental stage of her wanting to be autonomous, this is a tough time for parents too, because that little baby that you've been taking care of wants to do stuff on their own, and they're going to do it, and you're working yourself out of a job, and you got to let it happen. You can't keep your kids from developing just because you're becoming less important for those things. You're becoming more important for other things. You got to rely on that. Sometimes, however, children can be in environments where their desire to do things autonomously can be responded to negatively. Either the parents don't want them breaking things, or they're just harassing, or maybe the parents are stuck. They want to be caregivers and they just hate the idea of their child becoming more and more autonomous. So, meaning well to keep them out of harm, they keep them from doing things that would increase their autonomy and therefore send them down the shame and doubt route. And so that brings us to an end to our content here. Lots of content, lots of stuff. Read the book, read the course book, watch the movies. There's so much to this age, so much that we know, and then so much of this is so individual to each child. And you can see no child is textbook. These are sort of like the ideal models, and that's sort of what this course is built on. Remember normative development. Every child sets their own course. But you can see these things. You can see them happening, and you can see why it's important for us to be able to develop environments in which children, where it's managed well enough so they're not getting into any serious trouble, but also allowing them to explore and being independent and develop that autonomy is important for trust and autonomy. And as we'll see, progressing into the later stages of Erikson's theory, we'll see how important those two are. So you have some assignments to go along with this, of course. So let's take a look at those. The first is a discussion on Erikson where I want to talk about trust and autonomy. Trust, things that you know of, things that you've experienced, and really interestingly, if you've already gotten in touch with your subject for your biography, and these are not necessarily memories that somebody's going to have, like I remember when my mom did this or that when I was 1. It's pretty rare that people would have that kind of memory, but certainly this might be the first time to kind of talk to that individual about what were things like in your early life. What were the first, what went on there? What circumstances led to you developing a sense of trust or a sense of mistrust? And I have this sort of theory, it's only proved wrong a couple of times, that individuals who, for tragically, developed a deep sense of mistrust at this stage, not later on when they got burned by their exes, at this stage, wouldn't have agreed to do the biography anyway. Sort of my little theory that if they had that much mistrust, they're not going to trust you enough to tell you their story. These are individuals that would not be willing subjects for the kind of assignment that it is. So most of the time, individuals that have been interviewed for this particular assignment have been very forthcoming with their history, what their parents were like. Interestingly, even when some of those stories were like, oh yeah, at this young age, my father left and my mom lived in a car, and then they had to send me out of state to be a nanny, kind of thing. I'm literally, like at 5, sending the child to be a maid or something in a household. These have been in the stories, but yet those individuals had other individuals in their lives that allowed them to develop that trust and developed a good sense of trust and autonomy in the world. So when you look, you're looking at the product. You're looking at the adult who's been able to survive until 65. Good life, in general. Most people that have been subjects to this assignment. And then you're like, it's similar. The person, you can almost rely on it. There's someone in your life, even if you had a horrible set of parents, there's somebody in your life, and they'll go, yeah, there's my grandmother. She was there for me. There it is. That's all they needed, was that one individual to be that important to them. So discussing those kinds of things in that discussion board in particular. And then we have a quiz to go along with that. And there's 2 questions. One is on myelination, where I ask you to explain why coordinated behavior is so much a part of a myelinated nervous system. And then that's an application question, a critical thinking, problem-solving type question. And then in the second one, I want you to express concepts that you've developed over time that represent a process of assimilation and accommodation. Let's say you knit, okay? Now, at one time, you had a very rudimentary sense of what knitting was. When you first sat down with grandma and you pulled out the needles, you had no idea. It just had sort of, all you saw was flashing needles, and suddenly scarves would appear. And then as you developed a sense of knitting, and maybe over the years, you can actually pick apart, what did I think it was? And then I learned it was something else. And then I learned different stitches. And then I learned different ways to organize the colors of, how do I change colors and all of this stuff. I know very little about knitting other than what I observed from my own grandmother. But nonetheless, picking something that you do rather well right now and kind of go back and kind of think about how you went through such a dramatic process of assimilation and accommodation to arrive where you are today. And I kind of want that story, an application of the assimilation and accommodation activity that you engaged in to become the expert at whatever it is that you're going to pick. It doesn't have to be academic, doesn't it? In fact, you're in school because right now you are assimilating and accommodating things related to your future career. I'm sure right now you know way more about infancy and childhood than you did before. At least something more. And so you're actively when you're going to school, you're activating the processes of assimilation and accommodation, and that's why it's sometimes hard. You're taking existing schemas and you're kind of ripping them apart sometimes and adding new pieces. Want you to think about something that you're already good at. It doesn't have to be academic. And dissect it in the way of identifying specific examples of assimilation, bringing in new information, and accommodation. That's the really tricky one sometimes. Changing existing information, existing schemas about something because you learned something new. You had to change an old idea. That's tougher to get. So I'd like to see that both of those in your answers. So that's the lecture for this week, for this chapter. I'll see you in the discussion boards, and make sure you get all that reading done. Remember, I'm just skimming the surface in these, and there's a lot more to get out of the book. And get active in those discussions. Get into the quest thing that's going on. Get into that. Post on the discussion board any questions or whatnot that you might have about that, and make sure you get started on those as well. My understanding is people are making their way through them, and I'm actually going to be asking how people are thinking, how they're experiencing it. Are they enjoying it? It is fun. Is it compelling, and whatnot? So I'll be sending some messages about that. So I will hear from you folks, and have a great week.